The following is rated not safe for work. It contains strong language, adult situations, and lots of spoilers. Discretion is advised.
In the criminal justice system, cinematic-based offenses are considered especially heinous. The dedicated attorneys who investigate these villainous films are members of an elite squad known as the Reels of Justice. These are their stories.
Order, please, order. The Reels of Justice is now in session. Judge Maynard Bangs presiding. Your eyes for the Honorable Judge Bangs.
Be seated. Welcome to the Reels of Justice. Today we are hearing the case of Napoleon versus King Kong, 2005. Napoleon, standing at 5'6", is at a considerable height disadvantage.
Boo!
He's also a 2023 epic biopic that chronicles the rise and fall of French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte as he adjusts to his newfound authority while navigating a tumultuous relationship with his wife, Josephine. 2005, King Kong is Peter Jackson's remake of the 1933 classic that chronicles the rise and fall of Skull Island alpha predator King Kong as he adjusts to his newfound life in the city while navigating a tumultuous relationship with young actress Anne Darrow.
Stop!
For those of you unfamiliar with our court proceedings in civil cases like this, the counsel appointed to represent each film will present their case for why their client is the superior movie. And ultimately, the jury will render its verdict as to which is the better film. This decision will hereby stand in all rankings and listicles from now on until the end of time ad infinitum. Mr. Dylan J. Schlender, you are representing Napoleon. You may begin your opening statement.
Thank you, Your Honor. When Napoleon was exiled for the fifth and final time to Skull Island, he quickly subdued the natives, but his lieutenants soon brought word to him of stories of fantastic prehistoric beasts that wandered the island. Through the superior use of cannons, the general subdued the greatest of apes, King Kong, and they triumphantly returned to France in order to leverage the ape's strength to conquer Europe. Alas, it was all for naught. The great beast became enraptured with Josephine's beauty and absconded with her to the top of the Eiffel Tower, only to be dispatched by a prolonged dirigible siege. Kong's last words were reported to be, "Roar, banana, Josephine."
I'm writing this movie.
Look, we all know that this is ridiculous, and I have to plead forgiveness. I had to get the silliness out of my system for the opening statement. But in this case, I do want to look at some issues of value and substance. We have here two epics of wholly different classes. I know that my learned opponent will attack Napoleon on historical grounds, and having just read Jeremy's book... Yeah, I know. Having just read Jerry's book on Napoleonic tactics, I'm ready for it. And I could probably make those arguments myself, to be honest with you. Thankfully, though, this is a head-to-head. And Peter Jackson's King Kong fails on so many levels of filmmaking and aesthetics that Napoleon can indeed win the day. This will not be my Waterloo. Thank you.
Mr. Schlender will probably regret putting these head-to-head simply for the joke. And now representing King Kong 2005 is Mr. Jeremy Black. Please present your case, Jeremy.
Well, thank you. Just to reply to my learned colleague, first of all, Napoleon does win in one respect. It is a much better comedy. The number of errors, the farcical nature of the acting, it's a much better comedy. And also I'm slightly disturbed by my learned colleague's interest in Napoleonic tactics, because the most famous tactic I can think of him pursuing is the maneuver sur les derrières. And I can't imagine that one is what he really wanted to think about. Anyway, I will reserve the rest of my case till we get on to particularities.
Thank you, Jeremy. Mr. Schlender, please present your first exhibit.
Thank you, Your Honor. So, funny enough, the 800-pound gorilla in the room is not King Kong, but Napoleon's problematic interpretation of history. And I have to say, as an enthusiastic amateur, it did bother me. But what bothers me more is that we live in a culture where someone's understanding of a complex and narratively interesting historical figure like Napoleon is to be gleaned entirely from a 2-hour movie that's directed by a hack. So, let us say that ship has sailed, and let's try to look at Napoleon 2023 in a vacuum and look, we should, because there's a lot to look at. The work of cinematographer, I'm going to butcher this. Hopefully Ryan can unmute for a second to save me. Darius Wolski is...
Darius Wolski.
Darius Wolski, thank you, is something to be treasured. And we're actually going to be talking about another one of his movies in not too long. As we are treated to grand vistas, epic battles, and a sense of place in time, the movie looks and feels very grounded. When contrasted against King Kong 2005, we are seeing muddy, slow-motion action worthy of a Peter Jackson epic. That's right. With Kong, we are flung about from scene to ugly scene, whereas in Napoleon, it feels like we're walking through an art gallery. We are given time to drink in the lovely sets and places in a way that Kong is simply not capable of.
Jeremy, any rebuttals to this? How is the backdrop that you get in King Kong compared to Napoleon?
Oh, I think King Kong's a much more exciting film. And, you know, in terms of, to quote my learned colleague, value and substance, I think there's far more on the values, on the nature of society, on the strain and struggle of fame in King Kong. It's a much more interesting and epic take on America. I mean, I can understand a group of Americans like my worthy opponent being uneasy about it. I realize that, you know, he can see that this film, which produced in 2005, aimed clearly to subvert George W. Bush's policies and
I knew it!
A critique of capitalism in the place of Jack Black, no relative. I can understand why he might want to defend the, you know, Napoleon and, you know, draw attention away from the critique of America and American culture. And in fact, the absence of culture, the way in which the heroes of King Kong are King Kong, Naomi Watts as the girl, and Adrian Brody as Jack. They are the heroes, and they are, of course, all rejects from the, you know, the power apocalypse of America in the 2000s. So what this is it's a meditation on modern America, and it's disturbing to see that a modern American has come in on the other side and isn't willing to say that, yes, King Kong gets it right, whereas Napoleon is a mere flunky of power compared to that, a mere clothes horse for rather ill-fitting costumes and a permanent scowl.
Mr. Schlender, does the Emperor have no clothes?
This is interesting. I do think Peter Jackson, being such a hack, was trying to go for some of this commentary that Jeremy is laying out. And of course, naturally, he fumbles it through the terrible acting, the bad comedy elements in here. Everyone is acting in different movies. Chandler's performance does not stack up to Brody's, does not stack up to Black's. They're all doing different performances. And if you want to look at the commentary here, this was taking place during Prohibition, right at the beginning of the Great Depression. Everyone's running out of work. We're already told that Adrian Brody is a playwright who's on the government payroll in that arts program that they have offered. And Jack Black is looking to
get one of those.
Yeah, well, they're probably still around. Who knows? Technically, you could still do the Homestead Act in Alaska, so who knows? Anyway,
got a Napoleon versus Kong movie to pitch them.
We'll film in Alaska for the tax breaks. It's all coming together. So anyway, this commentary, though, it ultimately falls flat because the movie's about a gigantic ape that runs amok in the city. King Kong does not represent like the excesses of fame and power and things like that. He's just a very cool monster. At least he should be. He looks muddy and gross in all this CGI bric-a-brac that we'll address in my further argumentation.
That's a classic American obsession with looks.
Yes, it is. And
it's been working. Overruled.
Overruled. Of the environment. It's the way in which the environment has been despoiled by America, which is what Peter Jackson is talking about, as his protracted pain to New Zealand in Lord of the Rings.
Yes, I'd like to have Jeremy answer, how does Kong fit into your narrative of maybe victim of capitalism, or is he an agent of it?
Oh no, he's a victim of capitalism. He's not an agent of it. He's a victim. He's been taken from this environment where he's doing his best to keep down these awful dinosaurs. And what he's
They
instead
have to eat too.
and he's being shown for profit by a group. And in fact, it's also obviously making fun of the people that run television cinema studios, but making fun of them in the person of the Jack Black character. Surely you can see this. This is just as I made my point.
Yeah, but you see here.
Do you
I'll pass it over to
when we
Mr. Schlender, but
discussed
don't call me Shirley.
When we discussed Frozen, I pointed out that it was an account of late Marxist labor theory. I pointed that out, and clearly was intended in that way. So obviously, King Kong is a film which is a linked meditation on American power and the assault on the environment.
We all remember your argument in Frozen, Jeremy. Please let it go. Mr. Schlender.
No, look, though the problem with Haxon, it's just like Baz Luhrmann before him with The Great Gatsby, is that they're not Americans. They have a warped, disfigured view of America that they've learned from the Marxist books that you were just talking about through Frozen. So they don't actually know what it's like to be American, to actually have that spirit. And neither does King Kong.
Sustained.
That's why he runs amok. Thank you.
Totally sustained.
Yeah. So what my big point against Jeremy here is I'm not going to listen to hacks from Australia and New Zealand critique America when they don't know what's what. Okay. If they want to come here and live here for 30, 40 years, really research our history and not have this based Howard Zim, the people's history view of things, then I'll talk to them.
Live in the trenches.
Until then, they could keep making their hack movies for their hack audiences. Let's be honest, because I don't know how anyone but a hack could enjoy 2005's King Kong. Not to mention,
I'm going to put a moratorium on the word hack now.
Go! I call him
lost all meaning.
More time. My point is, 1933's King Kong is you can watch it whenever you want. All right, but I'd be willing to move on to my next point, Your Honor.
Any rebuttals to any of those points, Mr. Black, before I pass it back to Mr. Schlender for his next exhibit?
Wasn't sure, just to be clear, that there were any particular points, but
well, that'll make it quick.
I wasn't either.
It was like Napoleon, rather lacking in substance, but well presented.
I'm always willing to admit my mistakes. I simply never make them.
Yes, excellent.
So actually, something that Jeremy and I both kind of talked about, we just kind of went in a bit different directions with it, are the aesthetic notes. So beyond the visuals that we talked about in my first point, I think there's an element that we need to look at when it comes to the acting. And I think when we look at the aesthetics of acting, if we try to compare it to like classical music, there's a reason everyone in this courtroom knows who Mozart is, but they don't know who Pierre Boulez is, for example. And that's because of the choices these artists made. One in search of beauty, the other simply not. Scott's Napoleon chose beauty not only in the visuals, but in the acting and construction of the characters. Again, let us put to one side the historical ignominy of the piece, but looking at the characters in almost a Shakespearean light. We have Josephine as like a slutty Lady Macbeth and Napoleon as like just a Macbeth, I suppose. It is interesting, if not altogether faithful to the history. If we were to replace if these characters were just to exist as independent, unique characters, this is a very interesting and compelling story. We're talking about a man rising to power. Now, again, I know the historical elements are important, but I think a character and a person as big as Napoleon is to the point where we can afford to mythologize them a little bit. We do so at our peril. This is true, but poison is determined by the dose, right? You drink a little bit of whiskey, you're feeling pretty good. You drink too much, you're feeling
really good.
You feel like Maynard Bangs. But we can have a certain level of myth making in these historical movies because we can provide so much context through something like Jeremy's book on the subject, through other movies, documentaries, and things of that nature, right? So again, let's contrast this, because we're doing a head-to-head, to King Kong with its seemingly conflicting visions. Is it a CGI showfest, a comedy, an homage to what could be argued to be the greatest movie ever made? Unfortunately for Haxon, the answer to all these was yes. And to accomplish this in the bloated runtime required no one area to get the attention it really deserves. And this really suffers in the acting. Jack Black and Kyle Chandler are playing far too broad. Naomi Watts is really into King Kong. And the melodrama, which is very Billy Budd-esque, typified in the relationship between the sailors, get an education, do something with your life. I mean, oh my God, how painful is that? And all of that draws you out. When the monsters show up, you're like, oh, thank God the monster's here. But then we move into that next area problem I was talking about, the awful CGI. So the human element pulls you out. The monsters are supposed to pull you in, but they look terrible. We have Chandler's character saying, no one's going to say these are fake. Hey, look, Jackson, you can piss on my shoes and tell me it's raining, but then don't lean in and say, actually, I am pissing on your shoes.
Mr. Black, is he pissing on your shoes?
Well, I'm not really sure where to go with that. I'm very rarely.
Let's first talk about the pacing, because it sounds like we were talking about the interminable pacing of King Kong.
Well, first of all, I thought both of them were too long. There's no two ways about that.
That's definitely the common ground.
I mean, I think I think they're both too long. As far as the pacing was concerned, what is interesting to me about King Kong is that it is a series of miniatures. I agree entirely with my learned opponent that they are going in different directions, but that's quite normal in a film. There's a series of miniatures, and actually many of them, the very opposite. The pacing, partly because it is CGI, is in fact very rapid. There are, in the Lost World element of Skull Island, there are these rapid fights, and as soon as you get bored with one, it ends and a new thing starts, and they're really rushing from one to another. It's amazing. They don't have a heart attack. I was re-watching it this afternoon. I actually said to Sarah, how on earth do they cope with this? I was getting frightened. I was very frightened. I know what's going to happen. I mean, but I was very frightened of the scene with the insects, the giant insects.
The spider pit.
Yeah, in the spider pit. And I thought the Brontosaurus sort of panic, which is a very Western scene, that was pretty frightening as well. So no, I would actually say that they're both in their own way differently paced. I mean, you could say Napoleon the same. It's a series often of battle scenes interspersed with romance or other non-battle elements. And in that respect, both of the films are rather similar.
Mr. Schlender.
I actually don't disagree. Actually, that's what it does remind me of when Jeremy and I went to head for Frozen and Maleficent. You like, where's the connective tissue going to be? Now here we are doing Napoleon versus King Kong, and you immediately think, well, how the runtime is probably going to be the connective tissue and how it's paced. And there are pacing issues with both movies. I think Napoleon pulls them off a bit more, which actually really dovetails into my my third and final point, Your Honor, and that's going to be this the synth. So it's not only about the pacing; it's kind of a synthesis of my previous points as well, and it really boils down to the word dynamicism, right? What we actually see moving and happening on the screen. So Napoleon, considering its run length, the battle scenes are kind of short, visceral, and effective, right? The action is punchy and dialed in. It has a quality of realness that we do not really see outside of more like a modern World War II movie, maybe in some Civil War movies, but not really in great European conflict movies. Rarely do they get this kind of treatment. I think Jeremy would agree that we're due for a movie about the War of Spanish Succession. Just don't let Peter Jackson direct it, because we'll be treated to those hapless Habsburgs are at it again antics. So as Reels of Justice has progressed, my distaste for large-scale CGI has increased, whereas my appreciation for a better quality of aesthetic has risen exponentially. So in this light, we must compare King Kong not only to Napoleon, but to its inspiration, and that's King Kong 1933. The action in each feature centers around a large ape, One is CGI and from 19 years ago and already looks dated and tired. The other is stop motion from 90 years ago and is awe-inspiring every time you see it. I have had the privilege of actually introducing the 1933 King Kong movie to my kids, to other people in my life who have never seen it. And it is amazing how it's still jaw drops. Maynard, I'm going to call you in as a quick witness. You watched it with my kids the first time they saw it. They were impressed by 33.
They were impressed. I introduced them to it, but you were there.
I was okay, fine. But it makes my point that there's a level of artistry that you get from 33 that's not in 2005. It's like listening to Bach performed by a full orchestra versus a drum machine. So how do you best pay homage? This is a question that troubles the greatest artists and hacks alike. And for a feature like King Kong, the answer has to be with better technology that's still faithful to 33's vision. We know it can be done, but we know it's really hard. But we see like Studio like Lakia do it. They did the like Paranorman and the two string Kubo and the two strings. I think they did Coraline actually. That might have been their first
Coraline. Yes, they did.
Yes, and I think that was like their first feature too. But my point is, we know it's hard. We know it's expensive. We know it takes a lot of money. But that is what great art demands, and it's just not what we saw in King Kong 2005. Because
Jeremy,
thank you. Yeah, I'll rest there though.
Jeremy, is King Kong using cutting-edge technology the way its predecessor did?
Well, for the time, it was using a lot of cutting-edge CGI. I mean, obviously now, and I think, my colleague is right, it now appears somewhat dated CGI. But although, of course, it was used in the Napoleon film, ironically, in order to make the battle scenes appear larger and more impressive than possibly otherwise, than definitely they would otherwise have been.
Yeah.
So, can I make one or two points about the thing?
You can make as many points as you want. It's your time now, Jeremy.
Go for it, my friend.
You have the floor.
Not in order to have a row. First of all, I think that there is a strong narrative theme. It is a story. I think the story works if you're interested in it. I mean, obviously, you've got to suspend belief. And obviously, you have to rely on special effects if you are going to have a story about a great ape and living in an island with lots of dinosaurs. Now, we scarcely need to be told 1 million years BC and all the rest of it about jumping time and bringing in sort of what jumps the Darwinian possibilities. But so it's an implausible plot from that point of view. But if you treat it as an adult fairy tale, I think it works better. I think there's some very interesting comments there about the aesthetic, because in the aesthetic, it could be suggested, is a matter not just of beauty. And Jackson tries for his beauty with his scenes, for example, of being on that ledge and looking out over the sea and the sunset scenes and all the rest of it. And then the descent from the ledge. It's rather 1930s-like scenes when Jack goes and rescues her and they go down on the rope. But what I was actually thinking is that there is an aesthetic of value there. And the way in which there is an attempt, following the original, of course, there is an attempt to do this classic Beauty and the Beast. The Beast has value, as it were, the true nature of modern society is presented as ugly, etc., etc., etc. And I would say that itself is a form of aesthetic. Now, you might dislike it, you might like it, you might think it's naive, you might regard it as Howard Zinn, and who is a silly man, and you might take it in those lights, and you might regard it as antipodean fantasy. Well, it is a fantasy story. Where it goes back to, of course, is the lost world idea. That's where the story goes back to. It doesn't originate in 1933 with the original King Kong. Those stories have always been used in order to make a comment on modern advanced society. And the theme of those stories has always been that modern advanced society has deep flaws, and that, as it were, the marginals, the other world that is revealed, actually shows that. Now, you may think that's naive, you may be right, but it's of that type. I would say Jackson produces an effective, though for my mind, overlong version. As far as Napoleon is concerned, I mean, what I found difficult about Napoleon was not the error. You expect error in films about history. No, it wasn't that. I found the actual depiction of Napoleon himself as rather static, rather stagey. There is also similarly a counterpoint of values, just as there is in King Kong. And the counterpoint of values in Napoleon is between the personal life presented as his idyllic relationship with the woman that understands him versus his responsibility to the greater world represented by killing other people. And I think that actually, in some respects, is less substantial than the ethical dilemmas presented in King Kong. Now, the reason it's less substantial actually links to what my colleague says. They could have made Napoleon much more interesting. I'm not a Napoleon fan, but they could have made him much more interesting by talking more about his desires to be a sort of modern Enlightenment figure. But they didn't. Instead of which he's reduced in his own way to a kind of animalistic character. I don't want to be pejorative about animals, but he is an animalistic character who is led by two factors. One is cock and the other one by his desire for fame. And both of them are, as it were, not changing. He lusts after Josephine all the way through. The practicality, as we know, is his personal life was slightly more complicated than that. And he's presented as lusting after fame through battle all the way through. And that presents us with a rather static, uninteresting account. So in some respects, he is more similar to King Kong, but whereas in King Kong, you don't expect the ape to necessarily have an epiphany. In Napoleon, you do expect that, and I am disappointed. So as an example of a children's morality tale, King Kong works better than Napoleon.
Mr. Schlender, is Napoleon more animalistic than Kong?
That, this I love having Jeremy on the show because it does force us to actually think, and
I'm thinking every time.
It's not, of course you are. And it's not a bad point, but I think we're looking to accomplish different things through this Napoleon movie. I think this Napoleon movie can't be viewed in the moralistic way that presumably we can view King Kong. I take some umbrage whether we can learn a lot about humanity through Kong. But I think having Napoleon as being a bit more stodgy and static actually serves the purpose of this particular narrative very well. And again, while it's not very faithful to the man, and you could even argue it's a disservice to the man if this was going to be your single point of history to understand Napoleon, but as this narrative is concerned, that duality between his personal obligations and his obligations as he sees it to country, which is also how he sees it basically to him. He views himself, he would be like Judge Dredd, I am France, that's what this Napoleon would bring to the table. And that characterization serves this movie very, very well. Again, it may not serve Napoleon as a historical figure, but this mythologized Napoleon that we're being treated to in here, it works very well, and it helps keep things focused for this 2-hour runtime, because we do know we're flipping back and forth between two stories. There's the love story and then his love of country story, which again is mostly love of himself. So I concede that point to you, Jeremy. He is a very selfish, and they say very animalistic. They call him a Corsican brute. They say he doesn't have manners. It's a common refrain throughout the movie. So even the movie is acknowledging that. And I do think it is more interesting that we see Napoleon die and we feel less for him than we do feel for when we see King Kong die, because we know King Kong wasn't. Yeah, so King Kong wasn't in a situation of his own making the way Napoleon was. say what you will about Napoleon, he made all those decisions. You know, his hand wasn't forced, and it's a very Shakespearean kind of movie because we see this man of power being undone by his own hubris, and it's a common theme in history. I mean, if anything, this Napoleon movie strikes me more as like a Richard Nixon movie, really, than a Napoleon movie, for example. But I feel there's value in that story. Whether or not Napoleon is the best vehicle for it, I am willing to concede that to you. However, in the context of being a head-to-head against 2005 King Kong, I think we extract more value from the Napoleon 2023 story.
Okay, Jeremy, I'd like to ask a question from the bench. Both these films are really adaptations, right? One of history and the other of a pre-existing film.
Absolutely.
I didn't know if you want to speak to which one you think executes that adaptation better to its
that's
source material.
That's a fascinating question. And of course, I mean, in a way, the Napoleon, and that's a fascinating question. And in a way, both of them also comment on and draw on a series of earlier films, because with Napoleon, there had been many films in which Napoleon had appeared. And as I've said, in King Kong, you can look back to things like Lost World, you know, the other films.
1925's Lost World,
yes. Yeah, which is in a sense King Kong is a comment on, because Lost World is indeed in exactly the same plot, except, you know, it's set in South America.
Effects done both by Willis O'Brien. So they're both O'Brien films.
So I think that they're both meditations. I actually think in their own ways, they have a lot to offer. I personally, as I said, Napoleon isn't really a film designed for me. I personally thought that the good things about Napoleon were the actress who plays Vanessa Kirby, who plays Josephine. I thought she was very good. I thought that the use of the kind of dovied staged scenes, particularly the coronation, and the idea, you know, characters looking as if they're in a dovied painting. That I thought was very good. And one or two of the battle scenes, particularly the early ones, too long, are quite dramatic. And although it's inaccurate, I thought the very start was actually fairly dramatically done. You know, the execution of Marie Antoinette. It's, you know, Napoleon wasn't there. It's inaccurate, but I thought it was done dramatically.
Yeah, so they're talking about the food shortages as they're throwing lettuce at her.
It was bad lettuce.
Yeah, I'm not saying that Napoleon doesn't have value. I'm simply saying that I think, and I don't mind so much the history side, although I did think that the director's response to criticism was ridiculous. I
agree.
What I found disappointing about Napoleon, and I'll say this, I found disappointing the rather static nature of the depiction of the protagonist. I think I would be more favourable to Napoleon if it wasn't that Joaquin Phoenix did, to my mind, acted it with a sort of, well, rather like less animation than King Kong, actually, in terms of the variation of facial feature. And that I found disappointing, because it had the potential as scripted to play a great role. A man who has this enormous potential, the way they presented it as a man who is unable to fulfill this potential because he can't have children, because he gets led astray, the classic one of a great man brought down by feet of clay, so brought down by his fascination with his own image and by his determination to have an heir. But, you know, there was the potential there to make a great film. Orson Welles would have played that role wonderfully, you know?
I always thought Marlon Brando would be a great Napoleon.
All right.
I really do.
I just didn't think Joaquin Phoenix did it well. And I'm sorry, that wrecked it for me. And what I find odd is when the second actor or actress, in this case Vanessa Kirby, is so much better. And I wanted to see her, not because she was a woman, but just she could actually act.
It can be both.
and she develops. So that's my concern about Napoleon. I think
well, Mr. Schlender, I'd like to throw it over to you to respond. Does Mr. Black could suggest that King Kong shows more growth than Napoleon?
Well, in this
because he's
particular,
taller.
Yeah, yes, I get it. But in this particular instance, I think I touched on that already. Like, I think it's okay that Napoleon is presented as pretty static, that we see, I think seeing Josephine be more developed. I mean, we get something very interesting too. Don't forget, at the end of the movie, it's never quite explained because Josephine's dead, but her voice is still talking. So is this Napoleon imagining her voice? Is this an actual disembodied voice of hers? It's never made exactly clear, but when she says things, next time I'll be the emperor, things like that, it's a very interesting way of looking at Napoleon. And those lines at the end only really land if Napoleon doesn't particularly grow. So they really wanted this to kind of be a stealth Josephine story, and it really works in that regard. And so having an actor like Joaquin Phoenix, who is able to stay that stoic the whole time, even in times of great throes of passion and the nerves hitting him in the middle of the battle scenes, I think that's a service to the movie, not a disservice. And I think it's incredibly intentional. I know how much we weigh intentionality in this courtroom.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, I didn't see that. So, there's a room for listeners to make their own evaluation. I'm not saying my colleague is wrong and I am right. All I'm saying is I didn't see that. To me, I have a different approach. But
it's a fair approach. Don't get me wrong. It's not a perfect movie.
But I mean, actually, one of the things I think, obviously most of your programs don't have me on. That's fine. But one of the things I would like those listeners, when we're both on, is to actually go away and look at the films and make their own mind up. I don't want somebody.
You'll need 6 hours.
Well, there is 6 hours well spent. I mean, how can you spend your time better than watching great films? I mean, what do you want to do? Watch tedious adverts on television or boring, self-regarding sports people who have about as much brain power as a banana? No, watch great films. That's a good thing to do.
I'd like to ask a question for the bench, but both protagonists here are shown to have an obsession with their foil, their significant other. Would you like to speak to how both films present the protagonist's relationship to that other?
Yes, I mean, one respect, of course, I agree with you. I think you're absolutely right. One of the things that is, though, very different is in the case of Napoleon, who is obviously a human being operating in a different context. It is driven by the desire for an heir. And in a sense, Josephine shrinks to a womb, and that is a loss of and by Napoleon. He is shown regretting it when he goes to Malmaison at the end. And dies lonely. I mean, ironically, King Kong does not die lonely. I mean, obviously it's very different circumstance.
He had all those people standing around him.
No. But Anne wants him, Anne is there regretting what has happened to him. There is a sort of rather curious, and of course, the succession, having a child, it's a doomed relationship.
Kong already has one.
Yeah, but as a doomed relationship, I think it's actually very interesting.
Yeah,
Schlender, would you like to speak to how the relationship?
I got you, Your Honor. It is a good question. It's some more connective tissue.
Some people thought these movies had nothing to do with each other.
Yeah, right. Can you believe it? And look at we've got 40
Well, I suggested. You'll recall I suggested.
We know.
And I hope you agree.
Not exactly the way I remember. You were there, Jeremy.
Bloody well did.
So what I would comment on that is in King Kong, it's really a contrivance, because we need to have the damsel in distress. And in 2005, like Naomi Watts seems to be a little too into it. Like the way she looks at Kong was more awkward than the first sex scene before Josephine and Napoleon. I'm just saying, you know what I mean?
Have you seen the 76 one?
Oh, God. Well, yes, actually. Well, so
in some ways it's a little worse.
This is true. And so here's the other point when it comes to this relationship and how they make the films work. The Josephine relationship drives the plot here. The relationship between Kong and Naomi Watts brings everything to a standstill. Like when they're doing that weird ice capade thing, it's like, what the hell? He just ripped apart a bus. What is this skating around? The whole time you're just like, where's the army? And then they finally do start shelling him, and it's like, oh, thank God someone's trying to stop this horrible giant. It's like, look, it's not King Kong's fault he's there. It wasn't Hammurabi's fault that kid got through the fence, but that the ape had to be put down for the good of humanity. So that the relationship simply doesn't work. It works as a plot contrivance, as a device, but it's not the heartbeat of the movie like it is in Napoleon. And so if you want to weigh that relationship and its importance, Napoleon comes out on top.
Yes. Well, can I just say, I mean, I think that's a very interesting observation, but I'm not sure you would expect in King Kong anything to be other than a plot contrivance.
Well, that's true. So I'm just saying.
Where is a historical character with ownership of the story? I mean, now that is a very funny stick. King
okay, but
Kong,
he could. Okay, but so Kong.
No,
Kong could be obsessed with anything, and those beats could still happen. Like he could find a giant banana that he wants to carry with him up the Empire State Building, and it would still be the same thing.
No, that's just primitivizing him, aren't you?
Well, a little bit.
Mr. Black, do you have any final exhibits before you rest and we go to closing?
I think, yeah, I do have sorry, you're asking me, aren't you?
Yes.
I do have a final point that I would like to make, and that is that it is, in a way, quite a historic film of a classical type. I know it's got CGI and all the rest of it, but the idea of a small group of people going to a lost island to pursue and discover is something that you've seen repeatedly, and that has in its own way a standard series of tropes. All of them have plot contrivances. They all do. And all of them require you to suspend belief. Some of them more so than others. I mean, I would have thought Jason and the Argonauts, which is in some respects the most famous, has far more of a assumptions that you have to suspend. Now, in the case of this one, what I would say is, I can accept that nowadays CGI is possibly overused. Yes, I can accept that. Though, as I've said, it was also used extensively in Napoleon. And I'm not quite sure how you would present dinosaurs and giant apes other than through some CGI. But I do think
did it for decades.
Sorry?
They did it for decades.
Yeah, stop motion, Jeremy. Stop motion.
Yeah, but they did
animatronics.
All right, they did. Yeah, but come on, that was pretty dull. What I did think was that it was a exciting story. I think it was well realized as an exciting story. I actually think it is profound of that type of, let us comment on civilization from the point of view of the savage, and we discover who are the true savages, which is the standard theme. And I think that worked very well. So I would argue it's a successful instance of its type. Now, our friend from the West Coast very commonly uses his brilliant device of a gentleman's 5 or 6, and I think that's a really helpful device. He is very, very good with that. This is not the greatest of films. It is not a film as great as the 1933 one. I would agree completely. I don't happen to think it's as good as Peter Jackson's first Lord of the Rings. I thought by the last two, particularly the last one, was hopeless, but it's not as good as his first one. But I do think it could come in at a 5 or a 6, and Napoleon should come in at a 4 or a 5. Because while Napoleon has strengths, I don't think it's a great film. And personally, on the margins, I think it's weaker.
Thank you. All sides have rested their cases. The attorneys will now present their closing arguments. Mr. Schlender, you may begin.
Well, we had a lot of fun today, Your Honor. And if
I did.
You made it through this whole episode and these movies, we are looking at almost 9 hours of your life that you are not getting back. So let us take some important lessons from these films. First of all, to you and the jury and everyone out there, it's okay to trust your gut. Kong looks bad. Napoleon looks good. We know this because in our soul, Kong made poor choices that Napoleon simply did not. The acting Napoleon is not a jumbled mess like it is in Kong. And we have through lines and arcs. We talked about Josephine extensively, for example, which again, while not all historically accurate, they do at least create a compelling narrative. And lastly, the action on the screen. We know what great ape movies should look like. They have always stood on practical effects work. We have 33's King Kong, Mighty Joe Young. I will even throw in Planet of the Apes. King Kong 2005 reminds us that this is not the way for great ape features. So as you weigh these two movies against each other, do not be afraid to choose beauty. There is already enough ugliness in this world. Thank you.
Thank you. Jeremy, please present your closing argument.
Yeah, just a very brief comment on the last one. I'm fascinated at the idea is that beauty consists of people's entrails being spread across
and horses.
In films. I don't think that's hilarious.
The eye of the beholder.
And also, if I might say, classically, dinosaur films have often been awful. I was cited 1 million years BC. I actually think the dinosaurs work better with CGI than they do with the classic films. So, there are different ways of looking at it. What I would say simply is this, that King Kong 2005 is a good film. It's not a great film. It is a homage to the 1933 one. It doesn't have, and it can't have, because the world of film has changed. It doesn't have and can't have the same context in production, values and methods. But in terms of what was possible in 2005, I think it works very well. It has pace. It has some interesting characterization. It has some good acting and acting. I agree with my colleague that not all the actors are necessarily on the same page in their styles, but then that is always the case. I thought Jack Black, again, no relation. I thought he was absolutely excellent, by the way. And I would lastly like to say that I do think that the Beauty and the Beast story makes us reflect on the nature of society, environment, and all the rest of it. And that is a valuable thing to do. I'm not sure what you would reflect, what you would gain if you were looking at Napoleon in terms of trying to reflect on the modern world.
Oh. Thank you both. Members of the jury, Mr. Maynard Bangs, Mr. Best Ben Haslar, and the 10th wonder of the world, Mr. Ryan Luis Rodriguez. You have all heard the facts concerning this case. It is now up to you to determine which film is the superior movie. The bailiff will escort you to the deliberation room to render your verdict.
Right this way, and if I do say so, I say Mr. Schlender's case is Napoleon blown apart.
What? Stupid bailiff. At least he doesn't get to vote.
No, he doesn't.
Okay, guys, how in the living hell did we end up with Napoleon versus King Kong?
And why does it work?
I am absolutely stunned. Ben, I want to hear how you're thinking about this case.
Well, they were saying like this is 6 hours, well spent. I disagree.
Agreed with that.
I would put this.
I agree that it was 6 hours well spent, but that's just me. I have
think
more
both
time
at,
to
like,
waste.
Gentlemen's 5s or 6s myself, where it's like, it's fine. I probably would have spent that time watching better films, but
Yes.
like Lord of the Rings or Blade Runner, which these directors have done. But anyway, as it is, it kind of boiled down to 4 different points for me: which was the best relationship, which had the best visuals, which made the best use of its runtime, and which was like the best homage to its source material. And each one does a bit differently. The one that's the biggest sticking point for me is the visuals. In King Kong, they do not age well. Even at the time, I did not think it aged well. Anytime they're running with like brontosauruses or whatever, it's like you could tell these things aren't there. Whereas compare that to like The Lost World, Steven Spielberg's The Lost World, like that preceded it. And
the second Jurassic Park,
and even the first one. Like we have had dinosaurs that you believe are there.
Yeah.
More so than this. The CGI, and that's why Napoleon has maybe an unfair advantage, because I think if you gave it 10 years, we would be able to spot the CGI problems a bit better than we can today. But as it stands, even at the time, I remember thinking Kong's visuals were not great.
See, to me, the CGI used in Napoleon is to save some money from hiring a ton of extras. If it was made in the 40s or 50s, they just would have hired that many extras and you would have seen fields of people standing around. They saved some money, but
Kubrick was trying to make Napoleon for the longest time, and I can only imagine what that would actually look like. Like, that would be truly amazing to behold.
Right, but to me, like, you can make Napoleon very easily in the 50s, whereas trying to do the action that they showed in this would have been hard in that time.
Plus, it's COVID times, so they have limits on how many extras they can even have.
Even outside?
Yeah. But for me, I would put this as a gentleman's 7 versus a gentleman's 8, and you're not going to believe which I gave the gentleman's 8. It was not Napoleon.
Wow.
I fucking love this King Kong. I love it so much. I hated it the first time I saw it in the theaters. I thought it was absolutely interminable. I could not stand it. And then I watched it on DVD when the extended cut came out, and I was like, yeah, I could watch another 5 hours of this. This is dopamine for me. This is monkeys and dinosaurs and just chasing each other around. I could watch this for countless more hours. So, obviously, the 33 is the superior version. That is a gentleman's 9. That is the ultimate movie monster masterpiece. That and Godzilla together are the greatest. But I love the self-indulgence of Peter Jackson's King Kong in a way that I cannot fully and accurately discern to you gentlemen today. But Rob, I want to hear how you think.
I hate the self-indulgence of this King Kong. It's like,
that's fair.
It's
that's
like Jackson
pulled out totally fair.
Every tool he used in Lord of the Rings, like all this weird slow motion, like when Frodo's being controlled by the ring, everything goes all weird and slow motion because there's like evil power. But here I'm in the woods and I saw dinosaurs and Jack Black's going crazy. Why are you doing this? Like he shoots the natives like they're the orcs. He does all his tricks, the mountains, the volcano, there's lava. It's all the same stuff. It's just, and it really bugged me this time. The CGI is real bad. But Napoleon's really boring. The only interesting things are the battles, to me, like, Toulon, Austerlitz, like those were sweet, and I'm like, yeah, he's going to get him on the lake. Yeah, that's great. And you got to wait all that other time. They both feel a lot like that. I thought one really great point was one of Jeremy's last ones. There's a theme to King Kong. It's Beauty and the Beast. I kind of think it's a toxic theme, right? I mean, the whole thing is this big tough guy got brought down and undermined by a beautiful woman. It's like the Samson and Delilah story, basically. Beauty and the Beast, blah, blah, blah. But I don't know what Napoleon's point was. If I'm supposed to leave Napoleon, the movie, thinking Napoleon's a bad guy or Josephine was bad, I fail. They all seem to do exactly what I would do in all the situations they were in, like just common sense things that anyone would do, I would think.
I hope you don't get any power, sir.
There's no point in here where Napoleon does something where I go, yep, that's the right choice. Like, oh, you're gonna storm and run a revolution? Hell no, you're gonna eat cannon. Like, of course you are. Like, of course he would do that. So it was weird. If I'm supposed to leave Napoleon thinking Napoleon's a bad guy, mission failed. Like, I didn't understand why they brought up all the death counts at the end. Is Napoleon supposed to be known for having a truly high number of casualties? He won a lot of battles. I'd assume he didn't lose that many men. So if it was supposed to be like Napoleon is this murderous butcher, like those little final numbers seem to, like, you totally missed it. He's a total normal dude to me. He even stuck with one girl the whole time, which I wouldn't have done if I was an emperor god. So, yeah, weird movie.
All right, let's start locking it in, guys. Ben, how you feeling?
So for the best relationship, yeah, I kind of agree with Maynard. I'm going to go with Kong. I think that's better. Visuals, that goes to Napoleon. Runtime, I think that also goes to Napoleon, just because there's just so much added to King Kong that's just not necessary, and everything I cut is the stuff that they added from the 1930 film. Like the story that you need is an hour and a half.
You can't cut the spider pit. Can't cut the spider pit.
Okay,
Yeah,
well,
they already
okay.
did. They already cut
So
it
an
the
hour and a
first
half
time. You
plus
can't
whatever
cut
And it
the
was a
second
mis-
time.
and it was a mistake the first time. You know, that's why Jackson's recreation, his stop motion recreation of the spider pit, is sweet.
And then lastly, best homage. I think it's a tie. I think they both kind of failed. So I'm going to go with Napoleon.
Rob?
Relationship, I think you took the wrong thing what I say. I think the better relationship's Napoleon. They both seem to have mutual respect for each other. They both seem to stick with each other the whole time. She builds Napoleon up. She doesn't sabotage him and basically get him killed the way Anne Darrow does. The story of King Kong is a man being destroyed by love. He's brought down by love. Napoleon
I
is
thought you were
raised
saying that's a
by
more
love.
interesting story, whereas like
It
Napoleon's just
might
like-
be more interesting, but isn't it more toxic? Isn't it a more toxic view of
But it's
women?
saying as much. It's saying as much. It's not saying it's a good thing. At
Whereas
least I didn't think so.
Napoleon, he finally starts losing when he gives up his wife. When he doesn't have Josephine anymore, that's when he starts losing. And when she's dead is when he finally can't keep up. Visuals, yes, totally Napoleon. What were your other Bens? What was your other?
Best use of runtime and
adaptation?
homage.
Oh man, runtime. I winced and cringed and counted my teeth throughout King Kong. Where I didn't quite with Napoleon, but I think that's part of seeing one movie 4 or 5 times and seeing this movie the first time.
Yeah.
You went. Which one did you go, Ben? I want to keep this interesting.
Napoleon.
Maybe you went Napoleon. All right, I'll go King Kong.
Oh boy, you shouldn't have done that.
No, because I don't really care. So there's a lot of problems.
I'm
Whoever
surprised I
wins,
actually
we
didn't
lose.
mention anything that I felt about Napoleon, but I actually think, honestly, that the movie is too short. No pun intended. I think that I am looking forward to the 4-hour director's cut that Ridley Scott will be putting on Apple TV Plus soon. It's one of those cases of like Kingdom of Heaven, the theatrical version versus the director's cut. Obviously, the director's cut is an hour longer and it's better. I actually think Ridley Scott is one of those directors that works better the longer leash that he has. And
I agree with you,
think,
Ryan, because to me, King Kong was a 90-minute movie. They stretched out to 3, whereas Napoleon's a whole guy's life. They tried to compact into 3.
Yeah.
So I think there was a lot more they could tell.
but I've already stated that I have a soft spot for King Kong. And so I'm going to let all the audience out there down to declare
I don't think
that this movie, King Kong, is the winner of today's case. Now let's go out there and
I don't
tell
think you're
that
letting anyone
juror
down. Are there
next
Napoleon
judge.
fans?
I think it's okay. I think we'll live.
I'm actually really fine with that, to be honest.
No dog in this fight. Mr. Foreman, have you reached a controversial verdict?
We have, Your Honor.
You have not.
In the case of Napoleon versus King Kong PJ style, we find in favor of King Kong PJ style.
Boom! Yay! They should have kept the sex scenes in King Kong. The verdict is so rendered. Kong is king. I hereby order Napoleon and his army to the depths of the spider pit, where their cavalry would be at a tactical disadvantage. Also devoured alive. Court is adjourned.
Oh, ho, ho. This is Napoleon Bonaparte with my very authentic French accent. Mr. Schlender, you had not do my predecessor very good justice. What happens in that courtroom?
Wait, is that French or German?
It's French.
It's a little bit of both, I would say. Yes, yes.
Well, Bonaparte, this was a court assignment. I really didn't have a dog in the fight, and I really didn't care for both movies. So I am just glad that Jeremy and I had such a fun, engaging conversation that brought up really good points. And I'm very okay with this verdict. I think it's very fair. You know, again, we're talking about the gentleman's scale. I think both of these movies are about a gentleman's 3. So I'm really fine with this. Jeremy, just love having you on. When we get to go head to head. Yeah, it's just always so much fun. So I'll toss it over to you. I'll talk to you guys at the post trial.
Yeah. And what did you think of that verdict?
Just very briefly, I think that it would be a good thing for a lot of the audience to watch both films and to make their own evaluation. And, you know, Ryan made an excellent point last time, which, I mean, he always makes excellent points, but he made an excellent point last time, that we shouldn't be assuming that most films are fantastic. And that actually it's often very interesting to judge consider, let's put it, against each other films which have strengths and weaknesses. Clearly, both of these films have strengths and weaknesses. I personally found King Kong the better film, partly because it had a narrative that worked through. I wasn't quite sure what Napoleon's narrative was, other than his life.
Yeah.
And there wasn't really a story at the end. And so, I think the best film won, but I agree entirely. If listeners have a choice to only watch one of the films, watch the 1933 King Kong.
Yeah. Here.
Absolutely. Oh, well, that's all we have from the courthouse. Let us return to that studio for post-trial analysis.
Wait, now I don't know where it went there at the end.
No, that was good. Pulse trial? That's
That was
perfect.
not even Cajun. That was barely Cajun.
Oh, it was Creole.
Ryan
That's what
is
it was.
Jeremy's favorite, and we are jealous.
Clearly.
It's because we don't say enough good things. Jeremy, it's been a while since you've been on here. Great case, but what do you have for a recommendation for us?
Yes, thank you. On the 2nd of February, a man called Christopher Priest died. There's no reason for you to have heard of him, but he was the author of the novel on which the film The Prestige was based. And I don't know whether many of you have seen The Prestige. It's an amazing film about a rivalry between two magicians in Victorian London. And with astonishing special effects, but also psychologically quite challenging. And I think it's well worth watching. I also watched for a second time Colin Firth in A Single Man. I think that's an excellent film. Set in California at the beginning of the 60s, in fact, during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yes, it's a Big Ben biopic.
Yeah, it's about a homosexual academic.
Thank you for laughing, Ben.
Yeah, no, it's a very good film. And the last one is one that possibly that you haven't watched, but that just shows that you only have the most flimsy knowledge of the world of films, which is the best one I've seen lately, which is Romeo and Juliet, which sets the Romeo and Juliet story among garden gnomes and is absolutely wonderful as a film to watch with 3-year-olds.
Schlender, did you see Romeo and Juliet?
I haven't. I suggested it for the kids one night. We watched the Queen's Corgi instead. I was going to recommend that. I might change my recommendation now to that because that's too good, Jeremy. I love it.
Romeo and Juliet. What do you got for us, Schlender?
All right. So I was thinking a lot about today and these aesthetic arguments and everything that we were going to bring up. And there's a movie that captured a lot of this concern from 2002 called Simone, and starring Al Pacino. The movie was an early. Well, I'm going to get to the shortcomings. Don't worry. Starring Al Pacino, this movie was an early look at what digital technologies could do to filmmaking. I think a lot of us forget that in the early 2000s, actors were legitimately afraid of being replaced by artificial actors, and this movie looks at that phenomenon. What is very interesting to think about, though, is that to play an entirely convincing CGI character, a real actress, Rachel Roberts, was used. Ultimately, it's a huge missed opportunity as it becomes a sustained misunderstanding comedy worthy of a rejected script from Frasier. So I am shocked, I tell you, that this was written by the same guy who wrote Gattaca and The Truman Show. The commentary it sought to present was relevant, and this was the right time to make it. It would look entirely different today, but I think we can see the principal fear of those early aughts was misplaced. The pendulum is swinging back, and this CGI miasma we've endured through the late aughts and teens will dissipate, and human sensibility on art and cinema will return stronger than ever.
Or they have hologram concerts.
Or it won't. It probably won't. Simone is streaming,
Spoilers.
alas, not on Tubi, but the Roku channel. Support your local library.
The first really popular actor who just sells their post-mortem rights away so that their kids can just keep collecting royalties while they're used in, they'll do it and they'll make a few movies. I bet people will see.
Well, I mean, they used Peter Cushing in Star Wars. I don't know. So
it's
they
pretty
Laurence
Olivier in Sky Captain. And that guy's been dead for
Hmm.
like 30 years.
But are
Yeah.
they like main roles? Like, De Niro CGI'd the entire way through The Irishman.
But that's de-aging. That's
That's
different.
and remember,
yes,
too,
but we're only a few steps away from him dying and them doing the exact same thing.
Yeah, no, but remember what the actors like Matt Damon and guys were concerned about in the early 2000s was being completely replaced by digital actors, right? So it would be
an
like
improvement in Damon's case.
Well, I know, but like that's the thing. It's like, but I don't think we have to worry about that level of digital augmentation because I think you still have people who would be like the Andy Serkis types, right, for the mocap and stuff. So it will never be pure digital, and if it started moving that direction, I don't think there'd be much appetite for it.
Plus, Simone is a satire.
I smell a one-track mind or a future Reels of Justice.
Oh yeah, it's potential, and to come from the guy who wrote Gattaca and the Truman Show, which actually does have really interesting commentary, that is a little ahead of its time too, because Gattaca is 97, Truman Show was like what, 99, 98, and looking at where we've come with gene technology vis-a-vis Gattaca, look where we've come with reality television vis-a-vis the Truman Show. Simone lacks the teeth of those two movies and kind of fumbled and wasn't really there. But that was the right time to make that kind of commentary, and it just falls a little short. But ultimately, we didn't end up needing it, in my opinion.
You know what you're walking into when the movie studio in Simone is called Amalgamated Studios.
All right. Well, I don't know about you fellas. Maybe you like to get your history from Ridley Scott. But I only trust my history when it comes from one source, Keanu Reeves.
Ooh.
Yeah. That's why you should allow Mr. Reeves to take you on a most bodacious voyage through history.
Oh, no.
In my recommendation this week, 1989's Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Two hard-rocking high schoolers who really know how to put the word high back in high school, Jeremy, are gifted a time machine so they can complete a critically important report for history class. They collect several luminaries from throughout history and transport them all here to the modern world of 1989 with hilarious consequences. Among these figures is Jeremy Black favorite, Billy the Kid, Genghis Khan, Sigmund Freud, the single most attractive Joan of Arc ever committed to camera, played by Jane Weedlin, swoon.
Whoa, Lily Sobieski, come on.
Trash. And, of course, Napoleon Bonaparte, who discovers a love for bowling and a local water park named Waterloo. Unfortunately, they do not get to meet King Kong, or that would have put a really nice bow on it. But eagle-eyed viewers, like yours truly, will spot a poster for 1976's King Kong on the wall in Ted's younger brother's room during a scene in which the characters discuss Napoleon, who's passed out in the room next door. So if anybody else can get any closer to getting Napoleon and King Kong in one movie than I just did, let me hear it. It's a cult 80s classic, and if it's a blind spot in your knowledge of world history, Jeremy, may I suggest you enlighten yourself. And of course, be excellent to each other and party on, dudes.
Love it.
Romeo and Juliet is a sequel, though.
Big Ben, what have you got?
In our episode pitting King Kong against the outlandishly improbable opponents, I thought it only right that one of us recommend the first time he did so, which is 1962's King Kong versus Godzilla. King Kong versus Godzilla was the third King Kong film, as well as the third Godzilla film produced. And this was produced by Toho, directed by Ishiro Honda, who, of course, helmed the original Godzilla film. And what he gave us was, and maybe still is, an absolute smash with great suits, two iconic monsters squaring off in climactic battles at Mount Fuji, which is engaging and thrilling, even if the writers do kind of cheat by giving Kong an unforeshadowed kind of Deus Ex Machina to even up the odds a little bit. If you're excited for Godzilla X Kong or whatever that is, hey, God bless, have fun. But if you have any affection for either of these two characters, you owe it to yourself to see the OG showdown.
So what was funny is that Godzilla was reinstated after King Kong was exiled to Skull Island, but then King Kong brought his troops back, and so he actually became First Council Kong again.
Nice. I like it. So I can explain the electricity thing real easy. There was originally the script Willis O'Brien wanted to do was King Kong versus Frankenstein or Prometheus.
Oh, right.
And Frankenstein, being smaller than King Kong, needed a power up. So when he got charged with electricity, he'd get stronger so he could fight King Kong. Cut to Toho doing the movie. They cut out Frankenstein, they stick in Godzilla. Now King Kong needs a power up. So he gets the electricity power. It just kind of transfers to him logically.
Oh,
Didn't they
interesting.
ultimately do Frankenstein versus Baragon?
They do, yep, and then they do Frankenstein versus, once Toho gets the rights to Frankenstein, they do Frankenstein versus Baragon, along with War of the Gargantuous. It's technically a Frankenstein movie as well. And people who like Godzilla versus the Sea Monster was originally supposed to be King Kong in Godzilla versus the Sea Monster, which is why Godzilla is revived by electricity. It's why he holds a woman in his hand. It's why he swipes at planes in that movie. It's originally a Kong movie where they just copy and paste Godzilla right into it.
Man, that's one of my favorite Godzilla movies too. I'm learning so much.
I know. Anyway, great recommendation, Ben. Way better Godzilla movie than -1. Ryan, send us on home.
Oh, boo.
Send us home, damn it.
My recommendation this week concerns Hong Kong action auteur John Woo, specifically one of his earliest films, 1979's Last Hurrah for Chivalry. Don't be deceived by the title, which suggests a pre-code screwball comedy. This is a kung fu picture of the highest order. Nobody fires 2 guns simultaneously. There's no slow-motion shots of doves flying, just impeccably choreographed sword fights and some minor inklings of plot. Apparently, it has something to do with assassins assisting a shopkeeper seeking vengeance against a kung fu master, but that part I copied directly from Wikipedia because I am piss poor at discerning and describing the plots of whatever I'm watching, even if I'm completely in lockstep with the film. But you're not here for the story. It's a means to an end to provide opportunities for balletic action, and Wu absolutely delivers on that front. It begins intensely and continues on that trajectory for 107 solid minutes. Last Hurrah for Chivalry is currently streaming on, you'll never guess, the Criterion Channel. Sorry, Dylan. I know you thought I was going to say Tubi.
I thought he was going to say
You
Tubi.
let him into it. It was so sad. And then he just ripped it away.
Shut the door right in my face.
I saw Dylan's face fall in real time, and
Isn't
I'm
that
so
satisfying?
sorry.
I love that. That's one of my favorite sights, watching his face fall. But with that, the episode has met its Waterloo. But we want to thank our guest, Jeremy Black, for joining us. Thank you so much, Jeremy.
Thank you.
But we hope everyone else will join us again as well, as the reels of justice keep turning.
Count it.
DJ style.
Please follow us on Twitter at Reels of Justice, Instagram Reels of Justice, and Facebook.com/Reels of Justice.